Welcome to The Umbrella Effect, Building an Unstoppable Inclusive Culture. I'm Cher Powers from Nashville, Tennessee, and let's get started. So what do we mean when we're talking about building an inclusive culture? We've all seen headlines. We know about the riots and protests. We've seen a lot of anger and racism and labeling. And we all understand that something is happening and it has been building. And most of us want to do something constructive about it, but we're not sure where to begin. And it's really uncomfortable to have a conversation. We don't know what to say, when to say it, how to say it. And my goal with you is to give you 3 tools in this hour that you can use immediately that will answer that question and help you have an comfortable conversation. So when we talk about diversity inclusion, we tend to think about beyond fair housing. We think about being out in the world, how we operate as realtors, how we treat our clients. And we've heard of terms redlining. We know that lending practices that are predatory have existed. We've seen a lot happen over the last 50 years in particular. Most of us maybe haven't been in the business, but we certainly know the history if we've taken a code of ethics class or a fair housing class. So what do we do? The question that really comes up to start is, does expanding diversity really create inclusiveness? Has a quota policy creating opportunities for minorities in our communities, in businesses, within our real estate world, by expanding diversity, are we really being inclusive? And the answer is not really. Over the years, quota was created to try to right a wrong, and it was a very noble point of view that was actually legalized, legislated, in order to try to make up for disparity in income and opportunity. But what happened with quota, as you can see by this chart, is it started by creating polarization. People who felt that they did deserve the job were being overlooked in order to right that wrong. And that created, of course, alienation for anyone who was hired, and they started feeling excluded and isolated. They were not supported to get ahead in many instances. And that created division as the groups became larger and the quota became a larger part of the business population. That company then found they were struggling with diversity and fights and struggles for control. So quota in itself, while it was a good start and well-intentioned, has not resolved the inclusiveness issue. And certainly when we talk about equity, we have to talk about diversity inclusion, but in an equal sense, not just allowing people an opportunity, but actually creating inclusiveness. The first thing that we have to talk about in terms of where do we go from here is unconscious bias or intrinsic bias. We've heard this a lot in the news. You probably have even seen the NAR unconscious or intrinsic bias training tape that was just released. If you haven't, it is on your state website and you can take a look at that. It's fantastic and a great tool. But the point of that video really is that every single human being on the face of this earth has unconscious bias. We're born with it. We will die with it. Our challenge is, are we allowing unconscious bias to dictate how we treat other people? And can we choose to do something different when we're not happy with the behaviors that we're expressing? So are you biased? The short answer is absolutely. And there's a good reason for that. When we come into the world, we have a wonderful brain. And one of the things that brain does is it protects us. And of course, as we evolved as from hunters, gatherers into the society we have today, we had to make very quick decisions on who was friend, who was enemy, what was dangerous, and make very, very quick decisions that we weren't even aware of, that fight or flight instinct. So our creative energy of survival and finding ways to react quickly, over time, we developed unconscious biases to all kinds of subjects. And a lot of things that we do every day, we don't think about driving. Plenty of times, I'm sure you've been in a car, been halfway down the road and didn't even think about the fact that you don't remember getting out of your driveway or going 3 blocks before you're really aware that you're doing it. That unconscious pilot is operating well, and it's aware, and its job is to protect us. So we know that it can be good, and you can think in your own life of ways that unconscious bias operates very successfully in protecting you. And sometimes when you're not paying attention or you're not aware of danger, of course, then there's no bias to protect you in that situation. So let's talk about Long Island Divided. If you have not seen the Newsday story, it was an undercover report that took almost 3 years to create. It is very, very detailed, and the study was made with the same realtor having a white and a minority client in a distance of about 3 to 4 weeks, who had exactly the same income, similar down payment, similar desire in terms of the type of home they wanted, amenities, location. And then they each tested the same realtor, and this was with all the big firms. And out of everyone who was tested, there were only 2 firms that did not have any instance of unconscious bias or discrimination against a client. And it wasn't blatant. The fascinating thing about this is that the person who was being discriminated against didn't realize it until they saw their video, their undercover video, and the video of the white client and how they were treated differently. In one instance, you'll see 2 people. One was asked for a driver's license and proof of financing or some kind of a bank letter before they would get in the car and drive this client around to look at property. The white client was immediately invited to get into the car. The African-American person in this instance had no idea that they were being treated differently. This study could have happened anywhere across the United States, and we can certainly, if we're being honest with ourselves, guess that we would have suffered a similar evaluation no matter where this test was done. The good thing about this is they've given us all the videos. There's a great write-up. There's a lot of information. It's very educational, and if you haven't seen it or read it, there is a link that you can see it. Google the Newsday undercover realtor study, and you'll find it. So when we're talking about how do we avoid this, how do we get out of a mindset of recognizing how we treat people differently when we don't even realize we're doing it, and most of the time it's unintentional. The first thing to think about is, how does it feel? If you can have empathy, if you can think through how you felt in a similar situation when you weren't treated the same, that you didn't feel that you had equity. I'm going to give you a couple of examples here. In school, when a teacher didn't call on you. In work, when you didn't get a promotion or your idea wasn't acknowledged. In sports, you were asked to be last or not selected to be on a team at all. In your family, there are families where you've got, the black sheep or someone who tends to not be valued as well as some of the other family members. Socially, have you ever walked into a room and not felt welcome, or come up to a group or a table to sit down and felt marginalized, that you weren't really welcome, that it was a conversation they didn't want to share with you? That is the development for the rest of our conversation, which is putting yourself in the other person's shoes and really thinking through how it feels to be less than. And we've all experienced that. So what do we do about it? If we understand what marginalizing feels like, what do we do? And then we start with emotional intelligence. And emotional intelligence, or EQ, is an absolutely fascinating study. And it is apart from your intellect or your IQ. And it is something that you can increase and improve. There have been studies done at the university level that emotional intelligence is a much more likely way to determine whether someone will be successful in work or school or family or marriage, because it is about interacting with yourself and other people. So let's break it down into a couple categories. There are 4 different aspects of emotional intelligence, and the first 2 are about internal. How do you manage yourself? Are you self-aware? Are you paying attention to your behaviors? Do you recognize when you do things and why you do them? And the second piece of that, of course, is self-management. You're regulating your behavior. You control your anger or a childish outburst when you don't get your own way. And then motivation is a piece of that as well. Are you self-motivated, or do you have to have reward? Do you need to be managed by other people? Emotionally intelligent people learn to be self-motivated, and that can be improved. The other 2 pieces of emotional intelligence are outward skills, and the first is empathy. And of course, I talked about that with marginalization, putting yourself in someone else's shoes. If you can remember what it feels like to feel less than, you can have empathy for someone else in their situation. And then social skills is, how do you put that to work? Are you sensitive to other people? Are you aware of the people around you and how they're feeling and what they might need? Social skills, how you interact. Are you outgoing, a good leader, skilled at solving anger, somebody being unhappy with a problem, those kinds of things. So all of that adds up to emotional intelligence. And we're going to talk about empathy in action at first, and then we'll get into some tools. So we all know the golden rule, and I'll just post it for you here. A couple ways that we can reflect the golden rule, which is do unto others as you would have others do unto you. Golden rule, we all learned it growing up, or most of us did. And that can be reflected not just in doing unto others, but how we interact physically, our tone, our body language. How are we reflecting interest in the other person by being present, and then responding appropriately to others' emotions. So being present in particular, we're all guilty of being at a mixer or a social event and having our attention drawn away from the conversation we're in. Having empathy for the person would be to acknowledge, I'm sorry, I had my attention drawn away. Would you please forgive me? And would you repeat what you just said? I really want to hear it. That's empathy in action, is reflecting on the fact that you noticed you did it, you're self-aware, and instead of pretending it didn't happen or trying to catch up, just acknowledging it gently and showing that other person the respect of being aware of your behavior and that you did disconnect from them. And then when we're responding to people's emotions, that doesn't mean fixing the problem. It doesn't mean getting caught up in agreement with them. What it means is acknowledging, I can see you're angry. I can see you're hurt. I can see you're disappointed. Tell me about that. It's that simple. There's no fixing needed, no cape to put on, no hero or savior complex required to sit with someone else who is upset or excited. I can see you're really excited that you got this project. Tell me more about it. Empathy in action. This is an ongoing process, and that means that we will be practicing our skills in building empathy and emotional intelligence throughout our lives if we want to build an unstoppable, inclusive culture. So let's talk about the first tool that you would use in order to accomplish that. It's being curious. This is an amazing thing that focusing on the other person and being interested in who they are creates less discomfort in an uncomfortable conversation, because the onus is on you making sure the other person feels comfortable and not worrying so much about your own discomfort. Easy to say, I know, but the way we do it, our first tool is by being curious. So I'm going to give you a couple tips right here on how to be curious and ways that you can be curious, not just about other people, but about what you're thinking and feeling and where it came from and whether you want to continue with that vein of thought. So here are a couple of tools that you can consider using. And I would point out this last one in particular, paying attention to decisions that you make that favor or disregard others. So it could be positive or negative. There is a piece of information in there for you, which is who you value and who you don't. When you're disregarding people, we tend to do this to people that we don't like, or people that we're uncomfortable around, or if we really don't understand them. So when you're finding yourself disregarding someone, it's helpful to think about, and again, being internally curious, why am I having this reaction? Why don't I want to listen to this person? So when we're talking about diversity and we're talking about creating an inclusive, equitable culture, we need to look far beyond racism and ethnicity or religion or gender orientation, which has been the focus of a lot of the equal rights movement for the last several years. That is absolutely, these are important topics, and we must continue to look for equitable solutions to include people and make sure that they have the same opportunities and expectations as the rest of our community does. But when we're talking about diversity, it's helpful to think about it as a much broader piece, which is we are all unique and diverse, and we can be unconsciously biased against people who have a disability or a size that we might not be comfortable. Ageism, thinking that someone who's over 60 can't operate equipment or is no longer relevant, and somebody that's under 30 has nothing valuable to say and is lazy. These are all labels and criticisms that we use where we put people in boxes, and it is a bias, and it avoids the opportunity to get to know people individually. And the fact is, there are plenty of people over 60 who can operate equipment and are very sharp and at the top of their game. And there are people that are under 30 that are absolutely brilliant, hardworking, creative, and driving our future forward. And we miss those opportunities to see people as individuals when we choose to put labels. A label can be white privilege. A label can be calling someone a Karen. A label can be calling someone Uncle Tom. It's really important that we don't put labels on people, and we address behavior and we think about things as an individual act rather than an entire person. Other areas that I want to point out really quickly, because it's really an issue right now, is the division that's occurring over politics and religion. If we want to have relationship with our entire community sphere, half of our potential clients or relationships with other realtors are going to be one political party, and the other half will be the other, depending on where you live. It's really important that we start understanding the other viewpoint. And I think RPAC has done a really good job. If you're involved in legislative or you're investing in RPAC and you're starting to understand that the Realtor Party is not one party or the other, and you start seeing compromise in how we at the national level and state and local level will work with both parties to accomplish specific legislative goals. And when we're in our local community, if we choose to acknowledge ourselves as one political party or another, it's vital that we do it with respect for the other party, and that we are not putting up memes or negative comments that could reflect poorly on our position as a realtor and a leader in the community. I will also say age, generation, status, and income. These are also ways that we can be biased. And there are plenty of other things that I haven't brought up that you might find you're biased as well. If you want to learn more about biases, there are some tests that you can take online, and I'll bring those up in just a moment. When you're thinking about, am I biased? Typically when we react in a biased, we choose to pick a label and just throw it out there and put somebody in a little box. It's usually because we're in a high pressure, time pressure situation, we're distracted, or we're either in a really good mood or a really bad mood. We've got too much to do and people are in our way to accomplishing that. When we treat people as less than, it's typically because we have triggers that are creating that experience and we're not thinking about it. So slowing down our thinking is going to be very important. And I also encourage you to give yourself grace. Our biases do not always reflect our values. Just because you have biases based on where you were raised, how you were raised, your friends, your peers, your firm, your family, all of those things impact bias. And give yourself grace that this is X marks the spot, you're here today, but it doesn't have to remain that way. And you get to have a choice on how you want to relate with people going into the future. So our second tool is retraining your mind. And that really is that simple. It's making the choice that you want to treat people better. You want to become aware of when you are not treating people as equals or being inclusive. And then you're going to have an opportunity from that to create new experiences, expose yourself to counterexamples. If you find you have a specific bias, if you've never met any Muslims and you don't know anything about them, or you have a large group of Kurdish or Asians and you've never been to a festival or an event, a religious event, ask if you can attend. Look for opportunities to learn more about the people that you tend to have bias about. When you discover it, you get to make a choice. And one of the things that I mentioned earlier is a test that you can take. These are available online through a variety of universities, and they're called the Implicit Association Test. And you can check on anything that you think you might have a bias for. So you could do one on obesity implicit association test, and you can Google that and you will find several tests. They are all free, and the universities are gathering information from these tests. They're anonymous, but you're providing them with information, and in exchange, they are providing you with a tool you can use, which is finding out where you have issues, and then from there you can make a decision about how to improve it. You can also test yourself a year later and have the opportunity to see some improvement if you've been working on it. So what are some key bias triggers? In our goal to be in relationship with other people, and we may have a firm, we may be on a committee and we're trying to draw people in, we may have a special project, we may be deciding who's going to be invited to our party or our next mixer, assuming we get back out into the world and get to do that again. So key bias triggers, quota. Are you inviting the people because you're really genuinely interested in getting to know them better, or do you want to have a token Black friend attend your party or event or sit on your committee? Tokenism is very similar to quota, where you're essentially reducing someone to a token representative of something that you feel is lacking. And then myopic views, assuming that having a Black person on your committee, for example, will give you the entire Black point of view when you're making decisions for your committee. that's a myopic view. So some of the key bias triggers, some things that when we've actually started interacting with people, we tend to fall into several simple key bias triggers that happen most frequently in social settings. The first is an affinity bias. And what happens if you picture a committee, again, or a small group of people where one or two people tend to be the decision makers and the idea creators for the group, and everyone waits to hear what they have to say before they will chime in because they have an affinity for that person. They see them as somebody or someone's who are special and great leaders, and they like them, having an affinity. And it's also when you have a lot in common with someone, which is very typical. So you tend to be drawn to people you like. When you're in a bigger group, that could mean that you are excluding people that you don't like because you don't know them, or that you don't have as much in common with and don't want to take the time to find out who they are and what makes them interesting and different. Halo effect, it's exactly what it sounds like. That one person that can do no wrong in your life, you will never disagree with them, or it has to be really a challenge for you to do that. There's usually one leader who tends to have a hero effect, that halo. They're the, you know, star quarterback or the top cheerleader from high school. To give you an idea, they have the halo effect. Does not mean they're angels or that people don't resent or dislike them. It's just what they say goes. Confirmation bias, we've seen this a lot on social media. That's where people are posting their point of view and they're really just looking for people to confirm their point of view. And anyone who disagrees is shot down or bullied, quite frankly, if it's a pretty hot topic. And that is a confirmation bias. You're not really looking to have a discussion. You're looking for people to agree with you. And when you are the one agreeing, you're making a confirmation bias to support someone that you like and have an affinity bias with, so that they end up not learning anything new and ostracizing people who don't think the same way, which could go to groupthink, which is a larger group of people will push away people who have a differing point of view. This has been seen when the demonstrations have led to riots, and where one or two people are actually starting the violence or the damage, and then the whole group follows suit to the point where they have actually killed people, which was never the intent when the protests were originated. But the frenzy of groupthink can go very far, very fast, and get out of control. And in a group where you're trying to make decisions, it's very important to ask for opposing points of view and not have that affinity and confirmation bias going around the table where everyone is just agreeing and afraid to speak up and say, have you considered this unintended consequence? So when we're in groups, it's really important that we prevent this, even though it is easier to lead a group where everyone agrees. So taking action. Again, we're going to go to another tool, which is our third tool for today, and it is recognizing individuality. When we recognize individuality, it is very difficult to remain in a bias mentality. If we start asking questions and we don't accept simple conclusions, including positive ones, so you've met your first Muslim, now all Muslims are wonderful and deserve your passionate support. The fact is that not all Muslims are good and not all Muslims are bad. And again, if you've labeled them differently, it's still a label and it's still a bias. Recognizing individuality prevents that. And another thing that is difficult, we've talked about difficult conversation, uncomfortable conversation. How do we do that? Well, we talk about our own biases. We ask questions and say, I've never met a Muslim before, and I've had a picture, and I'm really not sure if it's accurate. Could you tell me more about how you grew up and where you're from and what your traditions and family life is like. And that starts creating individual relationship. It doesn't mean that you'll be best friends with someone, but it doesn't mean you won't. And giving them an opportunity where you're asking open-ended questions and you're inviting conversation and you're genuinely honest about where you are and why you're asking the questions, and that you really want to improve your relationship with people who are different and you want to open up your sphere, people for the most part will love and want to engage with you. And it is awkward and it is challenging, but again, it's making the other person feel comfortable and being comfortable in your discomfort to create change in your life and influence the world as a result. So when we're in a meeting, which a lot of us are in meetings with clients, or we're in meetings at a firm or on a committee, if we're in leadership, volunteer leadership, here are some things that we can do to recognize individuality. How do we do it? You make sure everyone's participating. Even if you're not the chair of a committee, you could say, hey, I haven't heard from Jane. Can we learn a little bit about what you're thinking? If you're chairing, it's very important to say, we've heard a lot of positives about this idea. I would love to hear from anyone who has a concern or any unintended consequence before we move forward, so that we make the best decision for our association, our firm, our HOA, our family, whatever it is that you're working on. Asking everyone to participate. It doesn't always mean everyone will speak up, but you can also mention, hey, if you have an idea after the meeting and you haven't had a chance to share, you want to think about it some more, please feel free to email or call me. Let's talk about it. Attributing contributions to the right person is very, very important in a meeting. If Jane came up with an idea and then Joe said, I love that idea and I've thought about this, and he adds to it, it's really important that whoever's leading the group or someone else in the group, when they piggyback on that idea and start developing it, that they say, Jane, this is such a good idea. I'm really glad that you brought this up. My idea to add to Joe's idea is this. Now you're inclusive and you're not hijacking someone, particularly if Joe is somebody that does hijack or tends to. You're giving credit back to Jane and you're recognizing her individuality and value and as a member of the group, and for bringing the idea forward. Making space for others. This is so simple to do, and I promise you, if you haven't been doing it, it will be a game changer in your life, and it requires nothing but a simple step back or sliding your chair over. Making space for others. When someone walks up to a group, and I've had this experience, you probably have too, where you've walked up and the group doesn't make room, someone doesn't step back, and you're kind of standing on the fringe, feeling marginalized and not valued, and you don't want to interrupt. And so you kind of stand there hovering and feeling awkward. People that are in a circle or standing in a group, it's so simple to take a step back. You've welcomed the person in, you can nod without interrupting the speaker and allow that person the space. This is really important, whether you like them or not, whether you feel like they're a pain in the neck, quite honestly, and a social drifter, someone that you really don't want to build relationship with for whatever reason. Common humanity and inclusiveness says they have intrinsic value as a human being, and opening that space up shows more about your character and the inclusiveness that comes from just how would you feel if you were in that spot. Same thing if you're at a table and someone comes up, slide your chair over so they can pull their chair in. If it's a private conversation, then say, hey, can I catch up with you later? We're right in the middle of something. And then do catch up with them later. The other items, we're going to talk about microaggression because it's such a big topic, and seeking alternative viewpoints purposefully. Again, if you know people and you're going to convention when we're back out in the real world, and on the ground for NAR, for example, choose to meet people that you don't typically know, that you've never met, that are from other areas. We tend to congregate with the people we know, and it's the good old home experience and all your dear friends, and you're hugging and seeing them from all over the world. But make the time to include new people within your sphere everywhere you go. It will help your business, but it will also help in your goal to be an inclusive human being. So what is microaggression? It's basically anything that marginalizes people by slights, put downs, and insults, and they don't have to be verbal. For example, when we have an implicit bias, it is usually unconscious, not always, and it's usually unintentional, but it is recognized by the other person. What do I mean by that? Two, I'm going to share really quickly is, oh, you speak good English, to someone who is clearly speaking English as a second language, or non-verbally, where you're clutching your purse or your bag under your arm, you're pulling away from somebody, you cross the street to get away from someone, which, by the way, might be an intelligent move, but being conscious about it is what's important, and not making people feel ashamed or dehumanized unintentionally. I'm going to go into microaggression in relation to people who are disabled because it's a great example of how we can be insensitive and have no intention of it. And it's a topic that isn't addressed a lot. So Darren Jernigan is a legislator. He's in Congress for the state of Tennessee. And I was delivering a check to him from RPAC. And he is a paraplegic in a wheelchair, and he has very limited use of his hands and none of his legs. So I came in and I was talking to him and sharing some of the things we were working on. And I told him that I was creating this class. And he said, well, what are you doing about people with disabilities? And I said, well, I mentioned them as a member of a diverse community and that they need to be recognized. And he said, well, I would love to give you some information. So we sat down and talked for about 45 minutes about issues that are related to how people with disabilities are treated and how they would like to be treated. So the first thing to remember is that they are people who are disabled. They're people first. It's not disabled people, it's people with disabilities. That is the preference. And the big challenge for him, here he is, Darren Jernigan, he's a congressman, state congressman, and he is having, if he has an assistant with him carrying things or an aide, the person that he's interacting with will talk to the aide or his assistant instead of talking directly to him. He's in a wheelchair, but he is not mentally disabled. And even if, and he said this to me and made it a key point, even if the person is disabled and severely mentally disabled, greeting them and acknowledging them by name is extremely meaningful. They can hear you. They do know their names in most instances, not all, but you can't know that. But the people that are their caregivers will be very gratified to have the person that they love and care for being acknowledged. So talk directly to the person who has the disability. Compliments for being disabled or condescending language that is so insulting, and no one wants to be complimented for being brave because they're in a wheelchair. It is not a compliment. And so I see a lot on Facebook where people are complimenting someone overcoming a disability, when in fact, what are they doing since they've overcome it would be much more valued to them as a human being. People shout at people in wheelchairs, which is kind of hilarious, but don't talk louder unless the person requests that you do so. And then asking before you help, even if there's a door and you typically open a door for people, just say, may I open the door for you? Could I carry that for you? If it's a blind person that you're sitting at a meal with, can I tell you where your food is, or do you need any help with any of your food? They'll say no or yes and thank you. Not leaning on or moving people's equipment. Of course, that should be obvious, but people lean on wheelchairs all the time, or move a walker or a cane or a crutch, thinking that it's in the way, when in fact you've just rendered that person incapable of getting up without someone finding the equipment and bringing it back for them. If you move it, ask for permission to move it, and find a way to stash it near them if at all possible. Sitting at eye level, people in wheelchairs in particular, or anyone who has a disability that where they're hunched over or unable to stand upright, sit at eye level with them. It hurts their neck to look up all day. And if you have a chance to have a conversation, pull up a chair. Even if you're in a group of people, if there's one handy, just pull it over and sit down. They will really appreciate it. Introducing yourself to visually impaired people immediately. Put your hand out. Even if it's a blind person, put your hand out and say, I've put my hand out to shake your hand. It's at your 6 o'clock or at your 3 o'clock or 9 o'clock, so that they can reach out and shake your hand. If someone is disabled in a wheelchair and you're not sure if they can use their hands or not, if you typically shake hands in a social setting and you've shaken everyone else's hand in the group, put your hand out to that person. They'll say, I can't, or they'll say, let's fist bump, or I prefer a hug, showing them the courtesy and respect of a handshake. Again, it comes back to allow yourself to be uncomfortable. It's not an insult if someone doesn't shake your hand. It's an insult if you don't put it out when you've put it out for everyone else. And again, even in a cultural setting where some people don't shake hands and some people do, some cultures will not shake hand with a woman. If you're in a group of people and you don't know that person well, putting your hand out, it's appropriate to allow them to say, I don't shake hands, and it's gracious of you to say, I understand, and nod your head and move on. So when we're talking about microaggression, the example I just gave is about people with disabilities, those actions of leaning on a wheelchair, of shouting at them, of talking to their assistant instead of them. How is that a microaggression? It's because it diminishes the person to less than. Anything that we do in a meeting, in a social setting, in our family, that disregards the value of another person or somehow lowers their measurement in terms of how they're treated versus someone else, that's a microaggression. So I'm going to take it a little bit further. And in a meeting, that could be interrupting someone, talking over them, not letting them finish a thought, taking over an idea. I mentioned that. And if you find yourself microaggressing and you realize right in the middle of interrupting that you have shown that you have disregard for the person because you didn't allow them to finish, the ideal response is to say, I apologize. I interrupted you. Would you please finish what you were saying? And if the person says to you, you interrupted me and I wasn't finished, and some people will be very offended when that happens, and it's because they're probably used to having it happen and they don't appreciate it. When they say, you've interrupted me, it is appropriate again to apologize and say, you're right. I am so sorry. Please continue with what you were saying. Defensive posture back, any effort to explain away what you did is inappropriate in that moment. Microaggression is simply disrespect for another person in the moment. And the way to solve it is to say, hey, I just disregarded you. I didn't respect you. I interrupted you. Please finish with what you were saying. You're right. I shouldn't have done that. And on we go. So what's next? Well, when we're talking about all these topics, it's a lot to think about, but it really boils down to treating people the way we'd like to be treated and to quit labeling people so that we can see them as individuals. So here are my little what's next, and you will have your own, and you'll create them as you develop your own process for building your emotional intelligence and being more inclusive in your firms, in your association, in your interactions with other people, in the way you treat clients. Being relentless, number one, if you really want to change, if you want to make a difference, it starts with you. It starts with me. We have to take charge of our own behavior and then mirror it outwards so that, or reflect it outwards so that other people can start mirroring it, and we will be living by example. But it starts with being relentless about uncovering our unconscious biases. I can't express that enough. It's not enough to go march or those things are good, or posting things that are supportive on Facebook, or inviting someone new to go to lunch with you. These are good. But if we're not relentless about uncovering our own blind spots, then we're really not going to change our own lives, which then really can't create the ripple effect that we're looking for, and ultimately a tipping point where more people are inclusive and there is an equitable society. Apologizing when necessary. If you're doing this right, you're going to be making a lot of mistakes. Give yourself grace and be prepared to apologize and drop any defensive posture and just acknowledge the error or slight and then move forward with the correct response. And then asking questions and explaining. If you keep stumbling over a challenge, let the person know, I'm struggling with this. I do interrupt all the time and I don't mean to. Please let me know if I do it again. I am so sorry. You deserve to be heard. That will go a long way in building relationships and making people feel included and valued. And of course, if you are a leader in a firm, if you're a managing broker, if you are a chair of a committee or a leader of an association, you have an opportunity to make sure that your policies are inclusive, that you are creating leadership opportunities for the entire community of realtors that you serve. So here are some reference materials that I'm a big fan of. There are so many books that are available. I want to make you aware particularly of Grovo.com, Grovo.com. They are a for-profit company that develop training tools for businesses, but they have created an amazing free training series on diversity inclusion. Absolutely wonderful. You can show these at home, you can show them at work, you can show them for association meetings. Absolutely wonderful. Each of them lasts between 3 to 7 minutes long. Most of them are very specific and they just work through a lot of different topics to help you understand. And again, in a non-threatening way, just a very simple matter of fact, here are things you can do, and helping you build comprehension and understanding. There are about 21 of them available. And then if you haven't taken the At Home with Diversity class, I highly recommend it. It is a good tool for you to protect your business and make sure that you're operating within the Code of Ethics and Fair Housing. And it's definitely a good foundation. NAR has also created a fabulous bias training video. It's on your state page, so you can go up there and see the video, watch it. You can also find it at NAR's site. And of course, the books and tapes that I've just mentioned and are on that list that I had up. So there are 3 tools you can use. It's this simple and this complicated. Be curious, retrain your mind, and recognize individuality. Every day is a new opportunity to start where you are and make a difference in your sphere. Ultimately, any leader starts with themselves, and good leaders focus on being the best they can be so that they can encourage others through their own behavior and leadership. So with final thoughts that I'd like to leave you with today, when we think diversity, remember it's just thinking independently together. If we remove labels and see people as individuals, if we're going to talk about Black Lives Matter or any issue, calling someone a Karen or labeling somebody's behavior as white privilege, you've cut the conversation off. At that point, when you use a nickname politically that is used on both sides of the aisle for they have their favorites, you've quit the conversation because that person understands that what they think is not important to you. If you really want to help people see what white privilege looks like, when there's a behavior, share your own experience and how that experience has shaped you and how you've learned as a result. Skip the labels and go to the heart of the conversation, which is how can we be better together? And then it's never too late to give up your prejudices. Start today and you can make a difference building an unstoppable, inclusive culture and creating your own umbrella effect.